Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone to the Eastside Freedom Library, to this evening's book event with Rick Bell, Professor of History at the University of Maryland. I would love to be able to tell you that we've brought him all the way from Maryland, but that's not true. The University of St. Thomas brought him all the way from Maryland, and we're getting a free ride based on that. But we're delighted that Rick can be with us. We like to say here that this is a place where people are not afraid of having difficult conversations and looking at difficult history. And as Clarence was saying earlier, we had great events recently with Chris Lehman about the role of slaveholders in the development of early Minnesota, with Bill Green about how white liberals in Minnesota during Reconstruction lost interest in seeing Reconstruction through. And today we're going to learn about the kidnapping of free African Americans in the North. And I think often I know as a historian, that we struggle with the questions of seeing people as victims and not recognizing the ways that they resist. But Rick's work manages to both capture the victimization of young free men and their resistance over their lifetimes. So I think everybody knows the restrooms are downstairs, and that we are Facebook live streaming this so that if you're in the witness protection program, don't let the camera catch you. And join me in welcoming Rick Bell from the University of Maryland and his book, Stolen.
Thank you very much. That was a lovely introduction. I'm so pleased to be here. I want to thank Peter and Clarence and Carla and everyone else who's made this event possible. I'm going to talk about some pretty sobering stuff, as Peter mentioned, for maybe about 30-35 minutes, and then hopefully we can have a conversation about anything that's on your mind based on what we've talked about so far. So thank you very much for this opportunity to speak about this important, I think, topic. Cornelius Sinclair was 10 years old, and he was trapped. He was stuck, locked in the belly of a small ship that was bobbing in the middle of the Delaware River, about a mile south of Philadelphia. And I can show you what that ship might have looked like. A ship like this, locked in the hold of a small ship that looked something like this. And a man grabbed this 10-year-old child from Philadelphia's Central Market about an hour ago, shoved a black gag into this child's mouth, tossed him into a wagon, and hauled him here. And it was dark below the waterline of that little ship, but Cornelius could see enough to know that he was not alone down there. 4 other pairs of eyes stared back at him, 4 other black boys. One looked about his age, maybe 9, 10, or 11 years old. 2 more were older, taller, maybe 14 or 15 years old. The last of them was smaller and shorter than the rest. He might have been as young as 8 years old. And yesterday, all 5 boys had been free. But now, suddenly, they were slaves. Prisoners of a gang of child snatchers who planned to sell their lives and their labor, most likely to plantation owners in the deep, deep South. And if their abductors got away with this, Cornelius would spend the rest of his life as someone else's property, somewhere very far away. He would probably never see his family or friends again. And Cornelius disappeared in late August 1825. He was one of dozens of free African Americans, adults and children, to vanish in very similar circumstances from the city of Philadelphia that single year alone. And in the early 19th century, Philadelphia was the hub of American slavery's blackest market, its newest market for slaves. Its gridded streets, its tangled alleys were hunting grounds for crews of professional kidnappers who made their livings turning free black kids like Cornelius into southern slaves. And they did this work swiftly and shamelessly, in brazen affront to Philadelphia's reputation at the time as the city of brotherly love, as a safe haven for people of color, and as the headquarters of America's anti-slavery movement at this period. But of course, to kidnappers and human traffickers, none of that stuff matters. And in truth, early 19th century Philadelphia was probably one of the most dangerous places to be free and black anywhere in the United States. And that was a product of its location. Here's a somewhat helpful map of the United States in this period. And as you can see from the crudely drawn red arrow on the right, which reminds folks roughly where Philadelphia is, Philadelphia was at the time the nearest large free city to the slave South. It was about 40 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line, which runs in part along Pennsylvania's southern border there, separating northern free states from southern slave states. And as Pennsylvania and other northern slave states had slowly disentangled themselves from race slavery in the 50 or so years after the American Revolution, that boundary line running along Pennsylvania's southern border had become ever more important, especially for African Americans. By 1825, which is the year that Cornelius disappeared, was abducted, Pennsylvania's southern border, the Mason-Dixon line, seemed to divide two worlds, separating northern free states from southern slave states. It was the closest thing to a modern international border as far as African Americans were concerned, anywhere in North America. And Philadelphia was dangerously close to that line, just 40 miles north of it. Philadelphia's proximity to that freedom line made its many free black residents attractive targets for professional people snatchers launching raids from the slave states. These people snatchers would prey on members of the city's black community relentlessly, putting bullseyes on their backs, putting prices on their heads. And the people they stole away could fetch anywhere up to $15,000 per person in today's dollars in Louisiana, in Mississippi, and Alabama, three of the new territories and states that were rising up along the Gulf Coast at exactly this time in American history. And by the way, at the time, they called this area, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, the Southwest, because that is to them the Southwest, right? We haven't added Texas yet. We haven't added New Mexico, California, Hawaii, whatever else we're going to go next. This is the Southwest. And the American settlers swarming into these territories and states, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, demanded and needed, they claimed, a nearly bottomless supply of forced manpower to cut sugarcane and to pick cotton. And they would take almost anyone to do that work, including, it seems, children as young as 10-year-old Cornelius. And buying some of their enslaved laborers from kidnappers may not have been these planters' first choice, but by 1825, their options for buying enslaved people were somewhat limited. And that's because of something that happened back in 1808. 1808 is not a hugely famous year in American history. It's not as famous as 1776 or 1865 or 1968. But something important happened in 1808 in the history of slavery, and that was a new law went into effect at the national level, which forbid Americans to continue to participate legally in the transatlantic slave trade. After 1808, it's illegal for Americans to continue to bring in black people from overseas, whether it's from the Caribbean or from Africa, for the purposes of enslaving them in the United States. And so in retrospect, that 1808 decision marks a major turning point in the history of slavery, because it spurs the growth of a replacement slave trade to replace the transatlantic slave trade. It spurs the development of a domestic slave trade within the existing slave states of the United States. After 1808, we see more and more interstate slave traders, willing to buy enslaved people from planters in Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, march them or ship them across the country to this new Southwest, jack up the prices and sell them to planters there who want to buy more enslaved labor desperately. This is the domestic slave trade. It's entirely legal, to be clear, and it's big business. About 1 million enslaved African Americans change hands and are sold and resold across the country between 1790 and 1860. A massive forced migration, one of the largest forced migrations in human history, by the way, the legal domestic slave trade. But settlers down there in the Deep South want even more. And the more they're willing to pay, the more tempting and profitable it became for anyone sufficiently cold-blooded to try to kidnap free children, like Cornelius, from free states like Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Try to smuggle them into the slave states, into this legal supply chain, pass them off as legally purchased people, and then sell them as slaves in the new Southwest. And these economic incentives leave Philadelphia's large and dynamic free black community dangerously exposed to these predators who come into their communities, snatch free people, and drag them into slavery. By 1825, the city of brotherly love had become the center of an interstate, interregional kidnapping operation. It had become the northern terminus of what I refer to in my scholarship as the reverse underground railroad. And so when I say those terms, and you'll hear me say them a lot tonight, reverse underground railroad, to be clear, I'm referring to the kidnapping and trafficking into slavery of free black Americans, generally from northern towns and cities. So this reverse underground railroad, and its much better known namesake, the Underground Railroad, they of course ran in opposite directions, right, for completely different purposes. But in some ways they are sort of mirror images of one another. On the Underground Railroad, that's the good one, that's the famous one, that's the Harriet Tubman one. On the Underground Railroad, enslaved people would abandon southern plantations and trek northward generally, dreaming of new lives and new opportunities in freedom. On what I'm calling the reverse Underground Railroad, free black people would vanish from northern towns and cities and be made to trudge southward to be sold into plantation slavery. On the Underground Railroad, conductors like Harriet Tubman risked their own lives and liberties to help black fugitives make epic journeys of freedom. On what I'm calling the reverse Underground Railroad, its conductors and station agents were kidnappers and human traffickers motivated simply by greed. Both of these networks, one good, one, I think we can say, evil, roared to life in the early 19th century to exploit what by then had become major differences in the legal status of slavery in the North versus the South. Both were loosely organized, highly opportunistic. Both networks relied on secrecy and small circles of trusted participants, on forged documents, on false identities, on disguise. Black voyagers in both sometimes had to hide in barns, cellars, and attics. The direction of travel in each one was different, of course, but the routes, the roads, the paths taken by freedom seekers and by victims of kidnapping and trafficking like Cornelius were often the same. They might even have passed one another on the roads from time to time. And what's more, the scale was the same too. Every year in the early 19th century, hundreds of black Americans went to extraordinary lengths to fight their way out of slavery and towards freedom. And every year in the early 19th century, hundreds of black Americans had their freedom stolen and were sucked into American slavery by these kidnappers and traffickers. Most Americans, I hope, know a good deal about the Underground Railroad. Historians have been studying the tactics and the strategies that conductors like Harriet Tubman used for the best part of a century now. to help freedom seekers escape from slavery. And the achievements of folks like Tubman are finally starting to command attention in American popular culture. And I think that is a wonderful thing. I spent my life in 19th century America, in early America, and there's not many people there I like the look of. There's not many people there I think are heroes. There's not many people I'd like to grab a beer with. But if you're looking for heroes in American history, you find them in the Underground Railroad, right? It's full of American heroes. And so it's wonderful that finally there's a lot of attention to folks like Tubman, right? There are now TV shows, walking tours, visitor centers. There's a big museum in Cincinnati, the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, which, as far as I can tell, and I know we're being live streamed to anywhere across the United States, but this is the #1 reason to visit Cincinnati, I think, at this point. And also there's this movie, right? There's this new movie, Harriet. This is not a perfect movie. This is not my favorite movie, but it is a movie that many people should see. It's an important movie. And it did pretty well, by the way. I think it exceeded a lot of people's expectations for this. In fact, the proof of that is that there are people called box office analysts whose job it is to guess how much a movie is going to make before it comes out, right? The folks who do this job reckoned that this movie would make about $8 million in its first 3 days at the US box office back in November, which is not great, not terrible, just okay. In fact, it made $12 million. Now, 12 is not a big number, but 12 is a lot bigger than 8. In fact, it's overperforming expectations by 50%. I've got a math major here, thank God. It overperformed expectations by 50%. And that's actually pretty amazing. I have never overperformed anyone's expectations of me by 50%. In fact, if my wife was here, she would say I frequently underperformed her expectations of me by at least 50%. But the point is, you put this stuff out there and there's genuine interest and appetite and curiosity about the Underground Railroad, as there should be. It's a wonderful thing. But this is the Underground Railroad. We know, I think, far less about what I'm calling tonight the reverse Underground Railroad. Its conductors, its station agents worked tirelessly to remain untouchable. And the identities of all but a handful of these criminals remain unknown to us even today, a century and a half later. Unlike Harriet Tubman, who actually did go on publicity tours and lecture tours to promote her work and her cause, these criminals who led this kidnapping operation across the country never gave public lectures live streamed on Facebook about their work. They never went on fundraising tours either. Only rarely do their names and their crimes appear in surviving police files or in trial transcripts of that era. That low profile in surviving legal sources, the result of the decades they spent in the shadows, protected by bribes, by corruption, by greed, by massive amounts of indifference among all the people that knew what they were doing but didn't do anything about it. Unlike legal interstate slave traders who sometimes bequeathed their papers to southern colleges and historical societies, the criminal outlaws who built this kidnapping network left no business records, no bundles of papers for historians like me or Peter to read and examine in reading rooms like the Library of Congress. They did not write memoirs about their careers. Their homes, their warehouses no longer stand. They certainly did not pose for paintings or photographs, leaving activists at the time to just guess at what they might have looked like. But as I argue in this new book, Stolen, which came out in October, just a few months ago, these professional kidnappers nonetheless left their mark everywhere in 19th century America. If we think not just about Philadelphia, where this story begins, but about Chicago, about Cincinnati, about Cleveland, about Boston, about New York, about any northern town or city with any sort of free black population. If we think not just about 1825, where this true story is set, but about 1835, 1805, 1815, 1845, each and every year in the first half of the 19th century, then we can say with depressing confidence that all told, these kidnappers and traffickers stole away tens of thousands of free black people. Many of them children, like Cornelius, who were under the age of 16 years old. Most of those they kidnapped could not read or write. Most of those they kidnapped were never heard from again. Their parents, of course, searched. They would advertise, they would petition, they would do everything they can. They would wait in earnest for any sort of news, but usually no news came. And free black people in northern cities like Philly had very few white allies at this time in American history, beyond the pretty meager ranks of a handful of Quaker-led anti-slavery societies. What's more, white employers openly discriminated against African-American job applicants, and white city constables generally ignored people of color's complaints and turned a blind eye to most white-on-black street violence. So when children like Cornelius went missing, their parents could hardly ever persuade mayors or magistrates to get involved, to do something, to do anything. It was rarer still for anyone to be able to gather enough evidence to issue search warrants, to inspect property, to interrogate suspects. And even then, experienced members of all of these kidnapping crews knew what to do and what to say, to talk their way out of trouble, and to get back to work. Raise your hand if you have ever heard of 12 Years a Slave. Pretty much everyone. For the record, the people behind the counter as well all raise their hands. 12 Years a Slave is, as you all know, originally it's the name of a memoir, of a book, written by a guy called Solomon Northup, who was one of these tens of thousands of free black adults and children to have their freedom stolen from them and be kidnapped and trafficked into slavery. Unlike almost everyone else who was forced to ride the reverse Underground Railroad, Northup would eventually escape. And in the title of his book, he tells you how many years it took him. How many years did it take him? 12, which is a long time. And unlike so many others, he also wrote about his experience, this extraordinary memoir we have. And in that memoir, 12 Years a Slave, which he published in 1853, he tells us what his experience on what I call the reverse Underground Railroad was like. He explains how in 1841, a pair of well-dressed, white confidence men lured him from his home in upstate New York into New York City. And it's important to know that at the time, Northup was an adult. He was in his mid-30s. He looks very youthful in this image. I didn't look that good when I was in my mid-30s. But he was in his mid-30s. He was literate. He was prosperous. He was employed as a musician. And in Manhattan, these well-dressed white kidnappers wined him, dined him, and drugged him. And the next thing he knew, he'd been sold as a slave to a slave trader in Washington, D.C., who then put him on a slave ship bound for New Orleans. And in New Orleans, he was sold again as a slave in one of that city's infamous showrooms to a planter, who then put him to work cutting sugarcane in the fields. And in 2013, an Oscar-winning film drew overdue attention to Northup's extraordinary autobiography and grotesque ordeal. And I, by the way, think that's an amazing film. I could teach that film every day for the rest of my life. I think it's a wonderful piece of cinema. However, both the memoir and the movie, I think, offer distorted, partial, or perhaps misleading views of the larger phenomenon of kidnapping and human trafficking. That there are some things about Northup's experience which turn out not to be typical of everyone else's experience. So, for instance, most kidnappings were committed not by well-dressed confidence men, but by people from much more marginal backgrounds who never set foot in a fancy bar or restaurant, who never wined or dined Anyway, more importantly though, these kidnappers rarely approach highly literate, middle-aged men like Northam. It turns out that's relatively unusual. These kidnappers preferred instead to lure away poorly educated street kids with ruses that could swiftly separate them from whatever friends or family they had. Very few of their captives would travel by ship like Northup did all the way down to New Orleans. Instead, these kidnappers generally forced most boys and girls they kidnapped to trek southward on foot in small walking chain gangs known as coffles. And their prisoners rarely ended up in fancy showrooms in New Orleans or on the auction block. They were vastly more likely, these captives, to be sold off in ones and twos along the way in the interior of Alabama or the interior of Mississippi to hard-up planters who wanted to buy more human beings but were too cheap to pay big city New Orleans slave prices. And all of that is almost exactly what happened to 10-year-old Cornelius Sinclair, one of the 5 central figures in my new book, Stolen. In August of 1825, Cornelius and 4 other boys living in Philadelphia, and their names were Alex, Enos, Sam, and Joe. The 5 of them fell into the hands of 19th century America's most fearsome gang of kidnappers. Their captors would hustle them onto a ship just outside Philadelphia, in the top right-hand corner of this map. Their kidnappers would warehouse them for a while in a pair of safe houses where the black dot is, down on the Delmarva Peninsula, right on the border between the state of Delaware and the eastern shore of Maryland. They would warehouse them there for a while. And then they marched these 5 children halfway across this great continent of ours to the deep south, where they tried to sell them as slaves. This is obviously an enormous distance. It's a journey of about 1,000 miles. It's a journey of about 2 million footsteps. It's a soul-destroying journey, right? I have a lot to say about this journey in the book, but I'm not going to say any of it here for the interests of time. And I'm also going to be a bit vague now, and for the rest of this presentation, about the last 3 words of the subtitle of my book. My book is called Stolen, 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery, and their astonishing Odyssey home. Because 4 of these boys will make it back to home, home being Philadelphia. 4 of these boys will transcend a story that they're not supposed to transcend. And that's highly, highly unusual. But I'm not going to tell you how they did it, because I want some of you to read the book. And I noticed there are books for sale over there, from Subtext Books in St. Paul, so we're happy to have them. But what did happen next, and how they managed to pull this off, is genuinely, as the book says, astonishing. It was astonishing to them as they made it happen. It was astonishing to the people around them that got pulled into this extraordinary campaign. And it was astonishing to me as I researched and wrote this book as well. And just to demonstrate that, what would happen next, over the next 2 years to these 5 boys, would include 2 murders, 3 exhumations of dead bodies from the earth, an escape, a recapture, a suicide, a race riot, a seance, the nation's first most wanted list, a lawsuit, and America's largest manhunt so far. But instead of putting that in the right order and explaining to you what it all means, let me just quickly note that the full story of what did happen next to these 5 boys, to Cornelius, to Sam, to Enos, to Alex and Joe, is a story that's never before been fully told, and I think for understandable reasons. Cornelius and the others were children at the time this happened. Only one of them could read or write. They all came from hard-up families that were not the sort to leave behind many traces in libraries and archives. And that's a problem, right? Because this is not a novel, this is not fantasy. I did not make this up. Historians, we need sources. We need lots of sources to reconstruct past lives in ways that are true and hopefully fair. And the stories and struggles of the many Americans who do not leave behind rich troves of papers, diaries, and letters, their stories sometimes just don't get told because of the lack of direct and accessible sources. So to reconstruct the outline of Cornelius's journey along the reverse Underground Railroad, I began by wringing what I could from a small packet of letters written to or from this guy. His name is Joseph Watson. He was the mayor of Philadelphia for a hot second in the 1820s. He would soon be voted out for being too nice, as far as I can tell. And from coverage of Cornelius's case in a single anti-slavery newspaper that took an interest in the time. And to be clear, historians have known about those two sources for a while, the letters and the newspaper coverage. But on their own, they're of course too modest, too thin, too few to sustain a complex reconstruction of this very unusual case. So I've had to go looking elsewhere for new sources, digging around in pretty much any archive I could think of for fresh sources that, when patched together, might allow me to tell this story and do it justice. And I should confess there's been a lot of what seemed like failure along the way, a lot of days in archives spent finding seemingly nothing useful at all. I know some of you in this audience have done historical or maybe genealogical research, or maybe that sensation of frustration is familiar to some of you. That when you go looking for needles in haystacks, what do you find along the way? You find a lot of hay, right? But you keep going, and eventually you start to find some needles with any luck. And ultimately, I certainly think it's been worth it. In the course of about 6 years of research for this book, I've unearthed more than 100 news sources about this case, buried everywhere. I think I counted for the book, in 35 different archives, in 14 different states, and in DC. And don't worry, I'm not going to list all 100 sources for you now, but I am going to highlight very quickly just 3 of them to give you a flavor of what we were able to find. With the help of another historian, I was able to locate the handwritten notes of a trial that took place in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, that would decide the fate of one of these 5 children, the fate of Cornelius, by the way, the fate of one of these 5 children for the rest of his natural life. A jury of Alabama slaveholders would decide whether this child should be forever free or forever slave. I also came across something I never thought I'd find, which is 2 letters written by one of the kidnappers, in which he spells out the identities of other members of the gang, describes their roles, and then carefully minimizes his own role and says, I was just following orders, I'm really no one in this gang, which was a lie. He had very good reasons to be lying. And the last source I want to mention just tonight is one of the sources I found relatively early on, but it's the source that stayed with me, unlike almost any other source in this dark story, or a story that begins quite darkly. And I found it in a Philadelphia newspaper about 3 days after Cornelius went missing. And it's, of course, a missing persons ad, placed there by his parents, at some expense, I should note. And it's short, so I'm going to read it to you. Boy lost. The subscriber's son, Cornelius Sinclair, a colored boy about 11 years old, left his friends yesterday. And as he had no cause and had never before absented himself, we fear he's been seduced away by some evil-minded person. Our son is a very dark, mixed-race lad, pretty stout-built, thin, long fingers, his eyes are weak, his left eye is smaller than his right. Any person hearing of our son will confer a favor on his afflicted parents by giving information to my employer at this address, Joseph Sinclair. Every time I see this, from the very first time I discovered it, 2 words in this 100-word ad jump out at me like they're 60 foot high. Afflicted parents. Can you think of a greater understatement than that for what Joseph and his wife must have been going through? So before I seek your questions, let me wrap up with a couple of brief reflections about why I think studying America's reverse Underground Railroad is important, and why Cornelius Sinclair's particular experience as a rider on it is worth everyone's time. To begin with, I would argue forcefully that then, as today, families simply belong together. And so any story about free children being ripped from their families, in this case being swallowed up by slavery, is a story worth getting out there and being outraged about for its own sake. But the remarkable ordeal that Cornelius and his 4 fellow captives endured also demands our attention for many other reasons. For one thing, it serves as a pointed reminder that in the decades before the Civil War, child snatching was heartbreakingly frequent, and black freedom in northern towns and cities was achingly fragile. It demonstrates, too, the important role that this grotesque trade in kidnapped free persons played in accelerating the spread of slavery into the Deep South over this same period. Now, as I said, I'm not going to preview everything that happens in the second half of the book, and the tone in the second half of the book is very different from the tone in the first half because of the extraordinary things that happen. But I'm not going to tell you exactly what they are. I'm not going to tell you exactly what happens to Cornelius after he was kidnapped and trafficked to Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And if you think I've dropped a hint, you're wrong so far. I've offered you some misdirection. But I will drop a few hints about what does happen next in case you do not read the book. And that is to say that the dogged efforts of all those involved in trying to save Cornelius and the 4 other boys from the horrors of slavery in the Southwest would have profound consequences. The rescue efforts of parents and allies and the aftermath of that campaign would radicalize black communities across the free states, emboldening African Americans to embrace violence in the cause of self-defense and in the cause of mutual protection as almost never before in American history. Their efforts would reshape the rest of the American anti-slavery movement as well, by encouraging anti-slavery activists with access to a printing press, like the author of this children's anti-slavery alphabet. Imagine such a thing, a children's anti-slavery alphabet, to begin focusing the northern reading public's attention on the suffering of black families being forcibly separated by kidnappers, by legal slave traders, and by slavery itself. And that theme, the focus on black families and their sufferings, is a new theme in anti-slavery writing, and it will become one of the dominant themes of anti-slavery writing for decades to come, in an attempt to universalize the plight of African Americans. Because aren't we all members of families? Can't we all imagine what it would like for our own families to be ripped apart? But most immediately, outrage over the abduction of these 5 boys would force lawmakers in Pennsylvania to push through a tough new anti-kidnapping measure. And that 1826 law, it's called a personal liberty law, would turn out to antagonize Southern slaveholders in ways completely different from any other law that Northern states had passed so far. It really pushed Southern slaveholders' buttons. And because of that, it produced court challenges to its constitutionality. It produced political retaliations against this law that ultimately culminated in the passage through the pro-slavery dominated Congress in Washington of something that I bet you've all heard of, which is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. One of the worst laws in American history, a pro-slavery abomination of a law that put this country on a collision course with civil war within a decade afterwards. Cornelius Sinclair's experience as a forced rider on this reverse Underground Railroad was the result of the confluence of massive economic and political forces. And what happened to him, and the things that he made happen next, would usher in a new chapter in the history of slavery and freedom in these United States. But that important context and that lasting legacy should not be allowed to obscure the urgent and human stakes of his particular story. A 10-year-old boy and 4 other free children were dragged into slavery in 1825. They would have to fight like hell to try to escape it. Thanks very much indeed. That has never happened before. The gentleman just blew bubbles at me. I will remember that for the rest of my life. Thank you very much for doing that. Any comments or questions about any of this? Yes, ma'am.
I wondered how this could be legal. Maybe I'm just not. It was legal to have the slave trade in the South, but it was not legal to take these free people, was it?
It was not. So the question was about the legality of this. This is completely illegal. Kidnapping is illegal in Pennsylvania, where these boys are kidnapped. Kidnapping is illegal in Maryland, where they are warehoused for 2 weeks. Kidnapping is illegal in Virginia, in Tennessee, the Carolinas, Alabama, Mississippi, the other states they pass through, 2 of which their attempted sale is engineered. Kidnapping is illegal everywhere. This is not suddenly an alternate universe where kidnapping is legal. However, it happened all the time. And it happened all the time to feed Southern slavery, which had an insatiable appetite for black labor and was not too picky about the original legal status of that enslaved labor. It happened because in Pennsylvania, which is basically a free state by the 1820s, and Philadelphia is basically a free city, basically free soil, that you can live in freedom and still be in deadly danger. I'll start that again. You can live in freedom in Philadelphia, but still every day someone will snatch you and take you to a place where you will no longer be clearly free, where your freedom will be ignored. If you have freedom papers, they will get ripped up in front of you, where your legal freedom won't matter anymore. And Philadelphia is a place where slavery is illegal, but that does not mean it's a place where racial justice is the order of the day. 1820s Philadelphia is a deeply racially divided and segregated place where the white population labor under intense, and I'm going to borrow a word from the historian Gary Nash, labor under intense negrophobia, fear of black people. They want black people gone, maybe to Liberia, maybe to Canada, maybe kidnapped into slavery, anywhere but here. And so the number of people willing to turn a blind eye if they actually see a kidnapping in progress of a black person in Philadelphia is staggeringly high. The number of people willing to hit and cross the street is staggeringly, depressingly small. And kidnappers from nearby slave states like Delaware and Maryland take full advantage of that racial climate, meaning that the only people that free black people in Pennsylvania can depend on are themselves. Other questions or comments? Peter.
Have you discovered that these stories were kept alive generation to generation among black Philadelphians?
Yes, absolutely, because my story is in 1825, and kidnapping does not suddenly disappear after my book is finished. There are dozens and dozens, hundreds and hundreds, pick your magnitude, but pick a large one, of kidnapping cases in this city and in other northern towns and cities throughout the early 19th century. Particular kidnapping gangs gain notoriety among members of the free black community over this period. The gang responsible for this particular kidnapping of these 5 boys is called the Cannon Johnson Gang, named after its 2 co-leaders, Patty Cannon and her son-in-law Joseph Johnson. It is a family business. Most people in this gang, about 10 to 15 people, are related by blood or marriage, with some exceptions, but not really. And this gang has operated for such a long time, they have a career that spans about 20 years, that everyone's heard of them. meaning every free black person in Philadelphia knows the name Patty Cannon, knows the name Joseph Johnson. And they're terrified of those people. They're regarded as sort of I can't say the word, bogeymen? But bogeymen, right? If you try to give your children nightmares by mentioning that name before they go to bed. But more likely, members of free black communities work diligently to deter and prevent kidnappings any way they can by spreading information from one generation to another. You want your children to know that name. You want your children to be on their guard because you can't protect them at all times. Because if you're fortunate, you have a job in Philadelphia. Men often worked as sailors out on the ships for weeks at a time. Women often worked as domestics in other people's houses. And their children often stayed at home. They were very unlikely to be in school because of the lack of schooling opportunities for free black children in this city at this time. Or the children might be employed in certain jobs. More likely they're out on the streets every day looking for work. And so that creates massive opportunities for unscrupulous kidnappers to pretend to be potential employers. Come with me, I've got a job for you, it's round this corner. 4 of the 5 boys in my story are not, don't have a gag stuffed in their mouth and dragged away like Cornelius does. The other 4 boys in this story, a guy comes up to them and says, "You look hungry, I've got a job for you. My ship is round the corner, it's full of boxes of peaches and watermelons. I need your help unloading." I pay pretty well, I pay 25 cents. 25 cents is enough for you to get, what, a few meals? Maybe a jug of beer, right? And these kids are hungry. One of them is homeless. They walk with their future kidnapper onto that ship. So you have to be on your guard, second by second, day by day, generation to generation. And to answer your question a different way, it is of course the case that there must be staggering amounts of intergenerational trauma, not just from southern slavery, but from living in freedom in cities like this with that terror, that daily terror that your child could be next. You could be the next afflicted parent on your street to be afflicted in exactly the way the Sinclairs were afflicted. Any other thoughts? Yes.
Before receiving Peter and Beth's newsletter, I'd never heard of this at all.
Right.
Was not aware of it.
Right.
And that's in some ways, though, not surprising because so much of anything that wasn't free, white, wealthy men wasn't considered history, and especially nothing that reflects badly on free, white, wealthy men. We do have some very, very, very loosely tangential things, so that hopefully all of us know about. Certainly the Dred Scott case, that example of a black slave at Fort Snelling who sued for freedom because he was in Minnesota and it was denied here in wonderful Minnesota. But also the wonderful legacy of Robert Hickman, the founder of Pilgrim Baptist Church, who made his way with this group of pilgrims up the Mississippi River to freedom. So locally we have the History Theater, and a few years ago they did the play of Robert Hickman's life and his escape with this band of fleeing slaves. And they do have a couple of plays coming up, much more recent, but dealing with redlining and housing and types of discrimination against African Americans right here in good old Twin Cities, Minnesota nice. So there are things that we can, but you have to look for them. They're not just sitting out there. So, thank you for the book. Thank you for giving us a different view. That's
very kind of you. So I think we exchanged something there, because I didn't know the Robert Snelling story, and it sounds like maybe this idea that kidnapping and trafficking was frequent may not have been on everyone's radar. I certainly wrote this book because when I discovered this, I was not aware of this either. I was aware of 12 Years a Slave back in 2011 when I started work on this, but to be honest, the movie hadn't come out yet, and so I hadn't given it that much thought. If you had asked me in 2011, how common were cases like Northup of a free black man living in the North being enslaved and trafficked into slavery? I would say probably not very common, but no one's really working on this. So as I dug into this particular case, and I can tell you how I stumbled across it if you're interested, it became clear to me that this case was actually one of thousands, if not tens of thousands of cases like this, and that Northup's was one of tens of thousands of cases like this as well. And I was completely ignorant of that. And so I wrote this book to find answers to the question like, how often did this happen? Why did this happen? What were the economics? How did people resist and push back? What trauma did it do? What are the consequences? What's the legacy? Those sorts of questions. Because I figured if I didn't know this stuff, then not everyone knew it except me. So this has been a road of discovery for me. And the fact that in this particular case, it's children at the center of it, and they turn out to be at the center of a great many cases, if not the majority. That hits me particularly hard. I mean, all of us are children, right, of someone. Many of us are parents of some people. When I began this journey, my wife and I were starting to think about planning a family. We now have two very wonderful, silly daughters who are 6.5, that's about there, and 3.5, about there. Their names are Ruby and Rosie. This book is dedicated to them. But as I've become a father, this hits me even worse, even harder now. The thought that my children could ever be snatched away from me, and that there's nothing effective that I could do to get them back or find out where they've gone or be sure that they were alive. That just tears at me in a really primal way. So I find it very difficult to look away from this stuff, even though we want to look away, right? We want to pretend this wasn't our history, but it is. Anyone else? Yes.
Statistics on the boys versus the girls that were kidnapped, and then how did you find this story?
So statistics implies a valid data set, a robust data set. When you're dealing with criminal traffickers who are remarkably successful at not being caught, and therefore not being processed through legal channels, through the criminal justice system, which is deeply unreliable in this period anyway. Counting becomes a very challenging game. And so we have to look at the sources that we do have, recognize what holes and biases they have, and then if we're forced to quantify, to do so gingerly and focus on orders of magnitude rather than precise numbers. So using the massive numbers of missing persons ads which fill early American papers, using changes in the census, using plantation records, using business records of legal slave traders, I can get the sense that the scale is indeed in the tens of thousands, but notice that's a pretty big order of magnitude, right? Do I mean 11,000? Do I mean 99,000? That's a huge spread. And I should say for the record that historians who have studied the Underground Railroad are no clearer about the scale of that network, and they've been studying that for 150 years. They can say with certainty that it's in the tens of thousands. They cannot tell you that it's 42,364 people. So statistics is a scary word. You asked about gender, about boys and girls. This is a story about 5 boys who are the focus of this story. But it is not the case that girls were not also kidnapped and trafficked. They were. In one chapter of this book, I'm able to rewind the clock from 1825 back to a different case, which this same gang perpetrated against an 11-year-old girl. Her name was Sarah Hageman. We have a startling account written by a private detective at the time who was sent to go looking for her and then couldn't quite find her in a safe house in a private prison in Maryland where he believed she was being held. But he wrote about everything he saw in that private prison, which is full of other kidnapped free children. And then he gave that report to his bosses, who were Quaker anti-slavery activists. And from documents like that, we know that the demand for children, for girls in the Deep South was no less strong and robust. Children are in high demand in the Deep South for actually pretty obvious reasons. Number one, they have many years of labor ahead of them. Number one, teenagers can do many of the things that larger, more difficult to transport adults can do on a plantation. Number three, if it's a cotton plantation, you don't actually need massive amounts of physical strength. You need dexterity and you need stamina, things that teenagers have in abundance, to be sure. To drive that last point home, 12 Years a Slave, both the movie and the memoir, features the person Patsy. In the movie, she's played by Lupita Nyong'o, the Nigerian and British actress. The real Patsy was, I think, 13 years old when she was brought to that plantation. Now, she grew up in slavery. She was not kidnapped. And the point is, she was brought to that plantation because what we need on this cotton plantation is 13-year-old girls. And there's a whole sexual dimension you can probably imagine as well for this. On the streets of Philadelphia, girls are actually relatively hard to find because if they're employed, if free black girls are employed, they're usually employed indoors. Thank you, in other people's houses as, maids, etc. Free black boys have fewer job opportunities, and the job opportunities they have often take them outdoors, into brickyards, lumber yards, dockyards, etc., which means they're out and about. They're visible and vulnerable, and their parents are busy. So kidnappers find boys much easier to snatch, though of course they snatch girls like Sarah Hageman whenever they can. Thank you very much. Oh, you asked quickly how I got involved. Really super quick. My previous book was about something almost as depressing as the first half of this book. The second half of this book is not depressing. The second half of this book is very different. Very different to the first half. I want to be clear about that. But my first book was about suicide in American history, between the Revolution and the Civil War. It was not a bestseller. I'm clearly drawn to very dark, I think, complicated topics, and my wife thinks my next book should be about something happier, and she actually has a suggestion, which I think is helpful, and her suggestion is my next book should be Kittens in American History. People would buy it, I think, right? May not be that great, but people would buy it.
Illustrations.
With illustrations, a coffee table book, right? Kittens in History. Abraham Lincoln with kittens. But I was writing this book about suicide, and someone who knew I was working on it sent me a link to a digital scan of an 1829 newspaper from Delaware, so 4 years after the events had been stolen. And it told the story of the alleged suicide of a woman in jail out in Delaware who was about to face probably the hangman for likely committing 3 murders. I began digging into her case, and I quickly determined that she probably hadn't committed suicide and so wasn't relevant to my interests. But I began digging into her life, and her name was Patty Cannon. I think I've just said her last name in a previous answer, right? Wow. She turns out to be the co-leader of the most notorious and long-standing gang of kidnappers and human traffickers anywhere in early America. And if I haven't said this already, let me be very clear. She was famous in her day. Frederick Douglass knew who she was. Harriet Tubman knew who she was. I wouldn't be surprised if the President of the United States had heard her name at some point. I had never heard her name in 2011, right? And so I began digging into her monstrous life, and through that stumbled on this one particular set of abductions, one of dozens her gang had perpetrated. But this one ends unlike all the other abductions her gang perpetrates. And so that set me down this path to tell a story which in some ways is very representative of the larger phenomenon, but ends up completely, wonderfully different from how these cases normally end. So thank you very much. Anything else? All right, then thank you very much. Oh, yeah, we'll do one more right here, okay?
A lot of things you're saying still have parallels to today.
Absolutely.
And like right now, they're working on the census. And I was just wondering, do you think that this kidnapping decrease accurate counting of the census or elevate it?
I think that the 1820 and 1830 census, which tells us that the free black population of Philadelphia was about 12,000 people, one of the largest, if not the largest, free black community anywhere in North America, only Baltimore was close, has its strengths and weaknesses, as any government authorized survey does. The government resources are greater than any alternative, so there's no better way to get an accurate count of the number of black people living in Philadelphia. But do I think everyone opens the door when a government pollster comes to the door and asks to count the number of people in your family? In a city like Philadelphia, which is a city which is a mix, when the free black community is a mix of free people who've been born there and runaway slaves who come here to hide and to blend in amongst those free people, do I think census takers are getting an accurate count? Absolutely not. Do you think there might be some black families who might not trust it's a government pollster, but might be one of Patty Cannon's people? Absolutely, that's reasonable as well. So the premise of your question is, I think, well taken. there are obviously lots of different resonances with a complicated story like this from American history and the complicated world in which we live now. And maybe you've each got your own ideas about what's coming to your mind. Maybe it's what ICE is doing at the southern border. Maybe it's the sufferings of families coming from Central America and the sacrifices they make to cross what they see as a freedom line, the Rio Grande, into this country. Maybe it's the way certain activists go to photographs of suffering children, or that poor father and his, I think, son who drowned in the Rio Grande trying to cross into this country. Or maybe your mind goes in a different direction. My mind goes to the idea that slavery and human trafficking are not dead and buried. I mean, human trafficking in Minnesota, I think you all know these stories, right? You know, but around the world, 40 million people woke up as slaves this morning. And in the United States, that number was not zero. In the United States, that number is about 100,000 people woke up this morning as slaves. On big agro-conglomerates in Florida and New York, where our produce is cultivated, in so-called massage parlors and brothels on the edges of every town and city, in sex slavery, and in domestic slavery in households of diplomats protected by diplomatic immunity in Washington, D.C., where all the embassies are, in New York, where the United Nations are. This is happening under our noses today. Now, thank goodness there are people today who've made this their life's work to draw attention to this. And if there's anyone in the audience or watching who doesn't know about organizations like Free the Slaves, Anti-Slavery International, or Polaris, go to their websites, send them some money. They need all the help they can get, because this is happening in our names right now. And we shouldn't ever congratulate ourselves in the United States for thinking that race slavery and the end of the Civil War has solved these problems, and palpably it has not. This is a story that reminds me of just how fragile freedom can be, and I think freedom remains very fragile in our modern world. But that said, the second half of this book, wonderful, amazing things happen, which make this a story I want everyone to take a look at, because the resilience of these children and the courage of the people who love them is actually extraordinary and remarkable, and certainly gave me some hope as I was wading through this. So thank you. You've been a wonderful audience, and happy to talk privately with anyone else. Thank you very much indeed.
You're willing to